Okay. I did it. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Okay, so I know we just met last week. I figured out with Joe this morning that the next class is not till April 9th. That's a long time from now. I think it's because of the vagaries of the synagogue calendar when we had other stuff uh, scheduled for Sunday and other things, which means that you have a long time to read The Merchant of Venice, because that's what I'm going to talk about on April 9th. And then I only have one more Sunday after that, which I'm going to talk about this issue of Jewish tourism and Holocaust tourism, and which she writes about a bit. And then we have, I think it's April 17th, I think is the date for the Holocaust Memorial Service. I was actually speaking with Dara Horn's publicity person. We're emailing back and forth last week, and we have a title. We're going to solidify the publicity for that. But I'm going to have her focus on Vary and Fry. We talked about, that was what we focused on last week. And it wasn't one of her standard talks, that she had this list of talks that she does. So it was a section of the essay where she talks about Hannah Arendt's The Banality of Evil. So this is called The Banality of Goodness on Vary and Fry, which is actually a really, really good take. And so that's we're set, and that's confirmed, which is fantastic. And that will be that's April 17th, that Monday night. We do have something the day before. The day before is when we'll just connect on the tourism stuff that she talks about, and then the following night is the program there. So, Yom HaShoah. It's a Monday night, that's when she's speaking. It's Monday night, April 7th. It's Yom HaShoah, the eve of Yom HaShoah at Westside Presbyterian. So that's what we're gearing towards. Okay, I also know some of you are watching. I was asked the question, are the things videotaped and on the website? They're not. Dan just does that for fun because he loves playing with cameras. But they will be on the website at some point. I'm not sure when. We're working on it. They will eventually get there. So that is that. I'm also going to ask, I know a number of people apparently are watching us from the eye in the sky. And so they've asked it's sometimes disruptive because the reason why I speak on the microphone is so that my voice is on the live stream. They can't hear when other people speak, and that disrupts those watching. So we can hold questions, and I'll pause a few points, and then I'll just have to repeat what you guys say, so that way people that are following can at least know what we're talking about. The topic for today is how the Holocaust is memorialized, remembered, the role that the Holocaust plays in America. So we always talk about, this dealing with anti-Semitism in America. Anti-Semitism in America is always connected with the role of the Holocaust in America. So, and it's almost impossible to think of one without the other. They're interchangeable there. And part of it, and one of the things that's raised up is always education. When we were saying we have this increase in anti-Semitic incidents, the most common type of anti-Semitic incident that happens all the time is when a swastika is found in a school locker room, drawn outside a house. It's always, we find the swastikas, and then one of the response is then, well, why are teenagers drawing swastikas, right? Why can't we do a better job in education? Do people really understand what the swastika is? And it's not a new development. It's been around for a while, but it's always shocking every time it's found. And happens across the board everywhere. It's happened innumerable times here in our own neighborhood, where a swastika is found. Sometimes it's been there for a while and just uncovered. Like there was one where they were in Ridgewood where they were redoing a sidewalk, and then underneath found a swastika drawn, and they don't know when it was, couldn't figure out how, obviously it was from before the concrete was laid. Before I came here, when I was in Westchester, we had an interfaith Holocaust program that was for Lower Westchester. That was a program that was done in conjunction with the Bronxville, Eastchester, and Tuckahoe school districts because a swastika was found over the train station, Bronxville train station, where many Jews would go on the train in the morning to go to work, with then the lists of Jewish teachers in the school listed there. So this was a big thing. So then we did a program with the 3 school districts with Holocaust education and writing essays and working with the municipalities and the clergy, and working on a local education project that was. Then I don't know if it's still ongoing because I've been away there for a long time now. Our service here in Ridgewood is also unique in doing an interfaith, Holocaust commemorative service. And I'll talk a little bit again why I think that's important. Most of the Holocaust memorial stuff tends to be more internal, Jewish internal, which we'll talk about how that's different and the role that it's plays. There are a few things that I want to refer today, of course, from Dara Horn's book. But the one book that this is already 20 years old, so it's a bit old, and it's not a novel, not a page turner like the stuff we were talking about last week, but it's a book by the historian Peter Novick called "The Holocaust in American Life." So again, it's more than 20 years old. It's published in 1999, but besides the fact that it's 20 some years out of date, it is an excellent survey of just starting with during the war years and then onward until this point, is the role that the Holocaust plays in just American life in general and also in Jewish life, how it changes, how it starts to be talked about more in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and reflects changes in American Jewish life in general. So a number of the themes that I'm going to talk about are sort of described in this book. And Peter Novick was an historian from the University of Chicago, one of the top people in the fields in American historiography. He's very critical of the way that the Holocaust is used and raises a lot of points, and he basically comes up with the question, what do we mean when we talk about the lessons of the Holocaust? What is it that can be learned? And then he kind of leaves that floating, that it's unclear, what the lessons are. So that's an overview. We're going to hit some of those themes today, but that's this book, The Holocaust American Life. And again, I said, even though it's dated, it's still very readable, in a very, very readable way. Okay, so I'll start with 2 passages from Dara Horn, and we'll use this as beginning of the discussion. So on page 100, one sentence from page 187, and that's her chapter called "Blockbuster Dead Jews." So saying how Schindler's List and other stuff, and how and then I'll just read the paragraph here in the middle of 187. I don't mean giving people ideas about how to murder Jews. There's no shortage of ideas like that going back to Pharaoh's decree in the book of Exodus about drowning Hebrew boys in the Nile. What I'm concerned about is giving people ideas about let me back up here so we know what she's talking about here. She's talking about the exhibition, the Auschwitz exhibition, that made its round. It was in New York. I don't think it's there anymore, but it was in Manhattan for a while. And she talks about what we learn from that, and what we learn from learning about the Holocaust. And she says, everyone must learn about the Holocaust so as not to repeat it. But this has come, and that's sort of the takeaway, right? Those who don't learn the lessons of the past are condemned to repeat it, right? So we have to go and see the Auschwitz exposition, so everyone should see that, so we learn the lessons of the Holocaust. She says, everyone must learn about the Holocaust so as not to repeat it. But, and Dara Horn writes, this has come to mean that anything short of the Holocaust is, well, not the Holocaust. So the bar is rather high, right? And she's raising a very, very, it's a very touchy subject in terms of the issue of the uniqueness of the Holocaust, right? When we say, well, yes, so what did we learn? We learn about the suffering, the genocide against the Jews. Well, what about other sufferings for other types of people? And then that gets very, very complicated then, where we want to learn universal lessons from the Holocaust. We want to learn the universal lessons about how people should be treated. But when we universalize it too much, then are we disrespecting the memory of those who did suffer in the Holocaust, an unimaginable type of suffering that's then not comparable. But if it's not comparable to other sufferings, if it doesn't compare to the sufferings of the experience of American slavery and racist prejudice, right, then that's where the fissions come about, right? Where if I'm not saying it's comparable, then who's suffering? My suffering is more than your suffering, right, or vice versa. So that's when things get very. That's when blood pressure rises, right? We're talking about the experience when you can understand why, and Novick writes about that, where American Jews get very sensitive when African Americans say, well, our experience, we were victims like the Jews in the Holocaust because we're victims of racism. We're victims of the legacy of slavery, right? And then you have sometimes you have Jewish Americans who know it's not the same, and it gets complicated there. So I want to get a passage here to read about that. That was very, even Katz, let me find that page here. Here we go. Here. So it's the idea of called Holocaust envy, right? Because the idea of remembering and memorializing the Holocaust has been so enshrined in American civic and popular culture that then you have Holocaust envy with other groups. Armenians saying, why aren't we remembering the Armenian genocide? And we mentioned African Americans and others. So this was a, here, at the beginning of that paragraph. Here. Jews, so I'm reading from Peter Novick. Jews were by no means alone in pressing for acknowledgement of past injustices. Japanese Americans spoke of their wartime internment. Actually, it just came up in my Hebrew high school class, right? And Chinese Americans memorialized the rape of Nanking. Armenian Americans directed attention to the 1915 genocide. Irish Americans sought commemoration of the potato famine of the 1840s. As a rule, these claims for recognition did not involve the groups in competition, except in the relatively benign sense that public attention was limited, and each had to elbow its way onto the stage. But the success of Jews in gaining permanent possession of center stage for their tragedy, and their equal success in making it the benchmark against which other atrocities were judged, produced a fair amount of resentment or Holocaust envy. Right? That how did we manage to get the Holocaust be the sufferings of all sufferings? So, and here's an example of how it got a little ugly. That the Smithsonian Institution refused to return the skeletons of thousands of Indians to the tribes that wished to rebury them, of Native Americans. And they're called, there was the so Clara Spotted Elk asked, what would happen if the Smithsonian had 18,500 Holocaust victims in the attic, right? Because they didn't want to return these skeletons because it was that belonged to Native indigenous Americans. So then American activists said, well, what if you had 18,500 skeletons of Holocaust survivors in the attic of the Smithsonian? You would keep them in the attic? A leading Holocaust scholar, says Stephen Katz, concluded his argument that massacring the Pequot Indians wasn't really genocidal by noting that many Pequot, I'm pronouncing that correctly, Pequot Indians, he said many Pequot Indians survived. And he wrote, and this is one of the major American Holocaust scholars, Stephen Katz, so he writes, as recently as the 1960s, Pequots were still listed as a separate group residing in Connecticut. He said, while the British could certainly have been less thorough, less severe, less deadly in prosecuting their campaign against the Pequots, the campaign they actually did carry out for all its vehemence was not either in intent or execution genocidal. You know, so trying to argue who gets to call it a genocide as if it's a competition. And he lost that argument. Why? Commenting on this, an historian of American Indians wondered what the response would be to the argument that the Holocaust wasn't genocidal because while the Nazis would certainly have been less thorough, less severe, less deadly in their policy towards Jews, after all, some Jews survived, a number of whom even live in Connecticut. So that was a touche. The Jewish Holocaust scholar definitely lost that argument there about that. And then, and then things got very complicated with the Armenian genocide because the Israeli government has generally been opposed and against Jewish statements in recognizing the Armenian genocide because of Israel's interest in maintaining good relations with Turkey, which is a very complicated strategic alliance. It's been more strained in recent years. Israel's often, sometimes the realpolitik, right, is sometimes taken precedence over ideological questions. Like we've seen Israel's very complicated dance with Russia now, with Putin. They don't want to take an overt stance the way that the other Western countries have because of the because you have Russia right across the border with Syria. You have Russian soldiers right there. It's as if we'll have to worry about Russian soldiers in Canada. Right, so there's a difference there, and so there was at one point in the 1990s there was a major conference that was sponsored in Tel Aviv, the University of Tel Aviv, about the Armenian genocide, and the Israeli government at the site put tremendous effort to cancel the conference, and the Israeli academics refused to give in to the government pressure and held the conference, but Elie Wiesel, Alan Dershowitz, and Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg were all three supposed to speak, and they canceled their appearance because the Israeli government asked them not to speak there. So, and it's this, it just says that, and that has nothing to do with what's a genocide or what's a genocide. This has to do with Israeli-Turkish politics, right? And what are we accomplishing? So we had a discussion at our Temple Israel board, and it was to acknowledge, I think during Josh Holden's administration, we passed a resolution to acknowledge the Armenian genocide. Josh Holden thought when he was president then, it was like we had an ethical responsibility to acknowledge that. If we are an organization that commemorates the Holocaust every year as we do, we need to make it clear and be on record that we acknowledge other genocides also. And I don't think that was a controversial vote on our board. No one in the Israeli consulate knew that we were doing that, so so we somehow got away with it. But it goes with this, the idea of, what it means being unique, and whether, we understand why it's important for us to say that we have a uniqueness, that our suffering is unique. I'll read you this last passage from Peter Novick's excellent book here. He says, the word unique is often used loosely and casually as an attention-getting intensifier. Try our unique dishwashing liquid. I met this guy last night, and he's unique. Claims that one's own suffering is unique and incommunicable to others are also common. And then his example of that is, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows my sorrow. But in the case of alleged uniqueness of the Holocaust, we're in the presence not of loose usage and hyperbole, but of serious philosophical and historical arguments. Indeed, a substantial scholarly literature which aim at logical and empirical demonstration that the Holocaust is unlike any other atrocity, a demonstration that will compel non-Jews to acknowledge this fact. And that's where, and he's, as one of the leading American historians, he's making a strong case against that approach, saying that we don't gain anything by holding the gold, he uses this phrase, by holding the gold medal of the Olympics of victimhood. We don't accomplish anything by that. But why is that important to have that sense of uniqueness? So we'll go back to that. and talk about why memorialization of the Holocaust is so important to American Jews, the public memorialization, that we want to sort of exceed everyone else's experience of victimhood, even to the point of intellectual gymnastics that are ethically troubling or laughable, like those few examples that I read there. So let's hold that. Okay, we'll take a comment. Go ahead. Yeah. Is there anti-Armenianism, Linda's asking? Well, there is in Turkey. Right. Yeah. There is, right. So the question is whether anti-Armenianism is a worldwide phenomenon, the way that anti-Semitism is. It's a good question. No, I think that Armenians still carry the trauma, though, of the Armenian genocide of 1915, the same way that Jews do. But there is, and that sense of it being suppressed also and denied, it continues to be denied by Turkey. By the perpetrator. So in a sense, it's a more, from the perspective of the national memory trauma, it's a much more difficult position that we are in, right? Because Germany acknowledges and accepts responsibility for the Holocaust. We'll talk about that a little bit also, whereas Turkey clearly does not. So there's a big difference there. In terms of anti-Armenian prejudice, I'm sure there is, I don't know, not to the extent, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a trauma when we talk about genocide. And that's where Holocaust memorialization is always gets complicated, right? That when it's the uniqueness, right? And to what extent that there is an acknowledgement of other. It was a debate when the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum was established, that it was going to have a section on the Armenian genocide. And then also there were efforts from the Israeli embassy and others to sort of just focus on the Holocaust, and we shouldn't universalize it. It's also an issue with Holocaust memorials specifically, and this is the case in Germany also, that should the memorials be specific to the Jewish sufferers? Should they be universal of all of the people who suffer in the Holocaust? Because not only Jews were the victims of the Nazis, or do you have separate memorials? So in Germany today, the main memorial is called the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, but then there's a separate memorial to gays and lesbian victims, and there's a separate memorial to the Roma and the Sinti. So those are separate for those, and those are much smaller than the memorial for the Jews, representative of the greater numbers of Jewish victims. But that's the question: can you do it together, or when you do it together, do you lose the identity? Because we're not even, in Eastern Europe, dating from the communist times, the Jews were never acknowledged as the victims. It was just, the term was victims of fascism. That was the term, right? So that was a generalization. So there's sort of we want to be specific, right? We want to name who the victims were, right? If you can't say they were Jews, then it's as if there's still a latent anti-Semitism. So that's why we wanted to be acknowledged that Jews were victims. But then we also have to acknowledge, but then we can't lose sight of the universal sense of condemning all types of oppression also, and that's where it gets complicated. We were talking, you guys remember in our Hebrew high school class before, that before the war, right, in the late 30s at the Evian conference, that was the failed attempt to get other countries in the world to bring in refugees from Nazi Germany, they refused to call them Jews. The term was political refugees from Germany. Right, that was the term that was used. No one would use the word Jew. Manny had a question. Go ahead. And then we'll get back.
You said that it's very important for American Jews to keep the Holocaust memorialized, basically keep it on the front page.
Mm-hmm.
But there are Jews all over the world. How about Jews, not just European Jews, but Jews in France, Jews in Europe? How about Jews in Japan, Jews anywhere? Are we unique in wanting to keep that?
So the question that Manny asked is, I was focusing on, and I haven't given some of the explanations yet about why memorializing the Holocaust, particularly a case in America. The question is, what about Jews in other countries in the world? It's a very important question, Jews in other countries in the world. got to finish before the Pro Bowl. So, but memorialization of the Holocaust in Israel is an entirely different topic. It's a whole different, and in Europe, it depends on where. In the former Axis countries versus outside, it's a different context everywhere that you look, and whether the country was a perpetrator or not. In a sense, the difference, the memorialization of the Holocaust in America, it's unique, and that's what we're talking about. It's different from other experiences, other places in the world, because the United States was not a perpetrator, although it was more of a bystander than we would have liked, right? And also because it's the United States, along with Israel, are the two heirs of European Jewry, right? There are Jews who live in Europe today, but it's not the center of Jewry, where it was before the Shoah. So that's what changed. So after the Shoah, the center of world Jewry moves to the United States and to Israel. Those are the two main communities. So, and again, the Israeli response to the Holocaust is very different than ours. Very, very different. So, and it both kind of picks up, right, for the beginning. So I'll say these right. In the beginning, 40s and 50s, you didn't talk much about the Holocaust. And it's sort of like, in general, like a trauma when it's still that immediate. And then the speaking about it and talking about it really only begins in both countries. It begins in the 1960s. In a sense, you need already another generation to come on board to think about how to talk about it, right? And what happened? So let's talk about what happened. So the most significant event in the whole world, right, that had everyone talking about the Holocaust and how to memorialize it was the arrest of Eichmann in Argentina, and then the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. And that was put on camera, and the entire world was watching, and it detailed to the world, and it was a very different presentation. Yes, you had the Nuremberg trials right after the war, but that was also... that's complicated, right? Because it was also the Allies putting the leaders of Nazi Germany on trial, and it was just in the midst of the ruins of the war. Here you have now 2 decades later, and it's televised, and that's the other difference, right? People weren't watching television in 1946 and 47. In 1965 and 66, they are. So you can watch, and you can watch the reports, hear the reports of what's going on. And a reflection of that was also controversial, and this is another, I had a few books here. Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. So this book is basically combines reports that she had made because she was a philosopher who was functioning as a journalist. She's a German-Jewish refugee herself. She was one of the people who are involved with Varian Fry, was involved with rescuing. She makes a small appearance in the book I read, novel I recommended. And her book was very controversial because she the subtitle is a report on the banality of evil. So the point that she makes in this book, argues, is that Eichmann was not a monster, that he was just some guy. And he was responsible for terrible, terrible things. So the point that she makes is that it's how do we understand, what is the lesson of the Holocaust? So her lesson is and some people said she was attacked from across the Jewish world. People said self-hating Jew, defending Eichmann, and that's not what she's arguing, right? Her point is a much deeper point, saying that evil is not scary monsters. Evil is normal people do evil things. And that's what makes it that much more dangerous. The opposite approach to understanding the Holocaust, which was also a bestseller, is so Arendt's book. What's the date when it was first published? Let me see. It's 1963 when it officially comes out. So you go a generation later from 1963. We got to go to 1996. 30 years later. Daniel Jonah Goldhagen's Hitler's Willing Executioners. This is a bestseller. Probably sold more money than any book written by any American scholar of the Holocaust, or any scholar of the Holocaust anywhere. made the most money, pretty much trashed by every other Holocaust scholar and German Jewish history scholar. And it's not only because none of their books were going to do as well as his book. That was part of it too. He takes the opposite approach, right? So Goldhagen's approach is that there was something evil about the way that German society was developing. And it was taking an evil direction. And that it was the people were being primed for seeing the Jews as not fully human. And he traces the anti-Semitism from the late 19th century, and he shows how the rise of the Nazis and then the what allowed for the Holocaust to happen is a result. It was germinating in history, in German history for half a century at least. It's generally condemned by the disagree. So condemned is a strong word. Taken issue with historians who, but they're two opposing viewpoints, right? So he's saying is that there are monsters, and the monsters were German monsters. And Hannah Arendt, who, okay, she's Jewish, but she's also German, right? So she's saying it's not, Germany wasn't any different than any other country. So the argument that she makes is that evil is an everyday thing and it could happen anywhere. And his argument is that this was something specifically, a problem with Germany. The book was also very popular in Germany because Germans, it's easier for them to say, oh, these were our evil grandparents. Saying, because you know who the bad guy is. And you've consciously changed your ways from there. And saying this was the problem of, and there's a real we're the sinners and we've started our country in a new direction. To say, you say to a German oh, the Holocaust could have happened anywhere, and they say, well, then that's great. Why did it have to happen here then? Why is this blog on our country? So in a sense, Goldhagen's approach is also easier for Germans to swallow. And easier for, it's easier for Germans to swallow because they say, well, this was really a terrible thing that happened here, and now our country was almost completely destroyed, and we've had to rebuild it from scratch. That's why 1945 in German history is called Stunde Null, which means 0 hour. The idea is you build completely anew, and it's completely different from what was there before. Hannah Arendt's argument, which most historians take that approach also, is a much harder thing to take. I've talked about this before also when I talked about just general German history at the time, that there's two main schools in understanding the course of German history from the mid-19th century. And one is what's called the Sonderweg, the alternative path approach, which means that Germany took a turn towards what Hannah Arendt calls totalitarianism, right? And that it had its own special path as opposed to the liberal democracies of Britain, France, the United States. And then there's the other side that said no, that things could have happened the way they happened and could have happened anywhere else in the same way, depending on the whole series of different factors. And I argued that, and in the book that I wrote on Jews in the German army in World War I, I explained that when I was Jewish that was there anti-Semitism? Of course there was anti-Semitism, but it's not anti-Semitism, German army, World War I. So of course it was anti-Semitism because it's Germany, right? They're going to a few years later they're going to kill everyone. I said, of course there was anti-Semitism, German army, but there was also anti-Semitism in the American army. There was also anti-Semitism in the French army, and I was just looking, at those things. But it's part of that broader discussion that if you understand that the evil, which we can call anti-Semitism, right, exists everywhere, it's actually a much scarier point. It's much harsher. It's saying that, there's this underlying danger that could be, it's not a danger from Germans, it's a danger from humans. But that requires us to universalize. It means that we have to universalize the bad guy, that the bad guy is not just the Germans, but it also means that we also have to universalize the victim and understand that it's not just a Jewish problem, and that anti-Semitism, and that's the whole issue of anti-Semitism, right? Whether you write it with a capital A or a lower K, with the dash, with the, we talked about that last year a bit. Is it a specific something about Jews that people don't like about Jews? Or is that an element of just a broader prejudice that just people are, because most people are just, will assume negative attitudes if the right circumstances are there. And as Jews, for different historical reasons, we've ended up being that minority that gets resented. And not that there are other people that have other sufferings. We don't have a monopoly on suffering, but we've had suffering. It's not a competition, but we've had suffering. So there's that tension between that two. But the Eichmann trial does bring the Holocaust into the picture. And I think that one of the reasons why Holocaust memory and Holocaust memorialization became so important after the 1970s, it kind of grows in the 70s and the 80s, is that American Jews stop feeling a particular threat from anti-Semitism, and that they were able to historicize it as something in the past. Right? And how do they do that? So let me read you one passage from Dara, and then I want to read you a very interesting essay from Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg. So she writes here, and that's, by the way, that's her point. Her point in People Love Dead Jews is that wake up. Anti-Semitism was not a thing of the past. And the shooting in Pittsburgh, and the other, we said there are people that love dead Jews and want to make live Jews, turn live Jews into dead Jews, right? And it's not a thing in the past. It's not restricted to Germany in 1942, and throughout the book, and most of the book is essays of historical issues. She intersperses it with sort of journalistic account of the Pittsburgh shooting, and then the Los Angeles shooting, and and then how it just, and then the third time it happened, the Times didn't call me for an op-ed, she said, because then it started to become regular with attacks on Jews. So she has this passage here when she writes, and each chapter is called Dead American Jews Part 1, Dead American Part 2. This is Dead American Jews Part 3. She writes, of all the tedious and self-serving explanations for why this scourge was apparently re-emerging in American life, and there were all different ideas, guns, Trump, trolls, Twitter, different theories of why we're seeing an increase in anti-Semitism. She writes, the most convincing was actually the most boring and also the most disturbing. The last few generations of American non-Jews had been chagrined by the enormity of the Holocaust, which had been perpetrated by America's enemy, Germany, and which was grotesque enough to make anti-Semitism socially unacceptable, even shameful. Now, the people who remembered the shock of those events were dying off. The public shame associated with expressing anti-Semitism was dying too. In other words, hating Jews was normal. And historically speaking, the decades in which my parents and I had grown up simply hadn't been normal. Now normal was coming back, right? That's that very sobering thing. So there was this, that anti-Semitism was not kosher as long as Holocaust memory was raw. But when Holocaust memory becomes not memory but just history, then you can get away with being anti-Semitic again. That you can be anti-Semitic and still think that you're a patriotic American. Well, you couldn't do that in front of Holocaust survivors and World War II vets. On Friday, I buried 101 World War II vets. I don't know how many more I'm going to have of those. There's who's left, right? That carried that struggle with them. So that's just saying, so that what she's saying is that the Holocaust played a role, and it sort of kept anti-Semitism down. But it's because we're moving away from the Holocaust. Now that's an argument for more education, of course. So she comes along with a different conclusion there also. Now, one thing, I didn't bring the book, there was, James had mentioned when we were talking a few weeks ago, he thought I was going to speak about how we remember the legacy of slavery compared with the memory of the Holocaust. And it was because that week the Jewish Standard carried a piece that was written by the editor of the Jewish Week that interviewed Chris something, is the author of the book for the words, the word, Passing the Word, which is, it was a bestseller. It still is one of the nonfiction best books of, it was published in late 2021, and it's by a journalist that he writes about all the different ways that America memorializes the past of slavery. You're going to find that it's Chris something is the author of that book that wrote it. And the editor of the Jewish Week interviewed him that what was it, that it's not a main part of his book, but the journalist, but he did look at the way that Germany memorializes the Holocaust, kind of compare that with the way that America memorializes its shameful past. So that's not the topic of that guy's book, but it's an interview that was run in the Jewish Standard maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. But what was an excellent book that was, and this book is from, on this topic, that was published in 2019. So it's also relatively recent, is by an American Jewish philosopher named Susan Neiman. It's called Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. And this is, it's not written by a journalist, it's written by an academic and a philosopher. She's an American Jew who lives in Berlin now, actually, and she's the head of the Einstein Forum, sort of a public education institute. But what she did was that she got a sabbatical and spent time in Alabama and in Mississippi, and really researched the way that the worst parts of not slavery but of the civil rights history is remembered in our country, and compares it to the way Germany memorialized the Holocaust. And the chapters kind of flip back and forth between the American South and Germany. And she makes very, very deep sort of analysis and understanding of how we take account of the past. It took a long time until there was a museum of African American history in Washington, D.C. We had a Holocaust museum before we had an African American history museum. There is a memorial for Martin Luther King in Washington. It wasn't on my 8th grade trip to Washington because it hadn't been built yet, and I'm not that old, So I'm turning 50 next month, but okay, I'm getting there, but not that old, right? Getting there. So one second, hold the quiet 1 second. So the point was that we're a little slower, right? Germany was faster, and also the memory is further back as well, in a sense. But there are these sort of, what do we learn universally, right, about how a country represents its past. The main site, right, in Germany, in Berlin, I mentioned it before, is the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. It is an extraordinary site with about 2,300 stone stelae that just stick up at different heights with an uneven ground, and you walk through, and it just emotes the sense of disjunctiveness, and it's meant to just cause you just to stop and think. And it was, the government had did a contest of about thousands of different architects across the world submitted proposals for the memorial. And this was the American Jewish architect Peter Eisenman was the one whose design was accepted. And then they had a very interesting debate where Eisenman didn't want any words anywhere. He wanted, just because you can't put words, you can't tell someone this is how you should think about the Holocaust, right? It's so many different ways to think about it. But the government insisted that we had to do education, so the compromise was that there's an underground museum that's called Place of Information, and it's underneath the memorial. And the museum is actually an excellent Holocaust museum. It's one of the best that I've seen. They work very closely with Yad Vashem, which is Israel's Holocaust Memorial Museum, in building this institution in Germany. It's been there now about 15 years, or less than 15 years. And it's right next to the Brandenburg Gate. It's right next door to the Brandenburg Gate. It would be, and when it would be like having a huge memorial to the destroyed indigenous nations right next to the Washington Monument. There is no memorial to the destroyed indigenous nations in Washington, D.C. Right? And it's been noted that Germany is sort of ahead of the curve in memorializing its own victims. Right? And there are some examples of this, and new examples in Southeast Asia. But it was important, and the reason why Germany did that is it was a part of the making Berlin the new capital of the United Germany post-1990. And part of it was that we got to if we're going to move the capital back to Berlin, which is where German nationalism is, we got to somehow make it kosher. And it's important that this monument happens to be right next door to the Brandenburg Gate, which is the sign of sort of, you picture all the armies, and especially like going through with the swastika flags and and marching through. So you need a balance. You need a balance there that was very conscious, and the Germans have been dealt with that. And then there's a lot of comparisons with how other countries dealt with that in different ways, right? The collaborator countries, the allied countries in Europe, certainly not as frontal as how it's dealt with in the German Republic. Okay, so I want to tie that back to America, but I'll pause here. Questions? Yep.
So you may be getting into it, but Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, is unbelievable.
Yeah, it's a great book. Yeah.
Caste system in India,
Yeah.
race relations in this country, and
Right, she compares, right, America, India, and the Holocaust.
I know you're moving quick, but my question is, there's a guy who's going to run for president who wants to deny any critical examination of probably the most important question about race in this country. How do we as Jews, how do we cope with it?
Right, the question is, first it was a shout out for Wilkerson's book on caste, which is an excellent book. I think it was 3 years right when it came out. I talked about that in one of my high holiday sermons. And then how do we approach with how do we respond as Americans with looking at racism, right, and looking at those uncomfortable aspects of our past when we have presidential candidates who suggest that it should not, that's what you're saying, right, should not be, or deny those efforts. That's exactly what Susan Nyman writes about here, and she writes about how as people, how we deal with memory and the weight of memory, and then the question is, what is it that we learn from that memory? So, yeah. Can't answer the problem on standing on one foot of how America resolves its issues with racism. That's a big problem. And I think that between Chris, I wish I remember his last name, the journalist who can't find it. All right, sitting on my desk. The thing from the Jewish Standard was sitting on my desk, and it didn't get here with the pile of books. So anyone that wants to know, I can tell you right after the class. Is that this is very positive. I think that we are starting, that there is a discussion about how we memorialize historical traumas collectively, how nations take responsibility for traumas for which they bear responsibility for, right? And thirdly, then how we implement that into education. It was just in the news last week that in France, they were going to make it that every French student needs to go and learn about the Holocaust and visits a site or something, and that was, a way was pushed through in order to deal with anti-Semitism in France. You should know it's always been a standard of the West German and now the German curriculum. You can't graduate high school in Germany without visiting a concentration camp. And it's just a part, and I go there and I see groups, groups going through. Now, again, would we require that? Because I think it came up last week, like about Holocaust education standards in the United States. In Germany, they can take kids to concentration camps because they got concentration camps there, So for us, we'd be a little more creative, right, in how we deal with the history. But I want to keep flowing back to that question: what are the lessons of the history? So I'll give you two examples from Germany, and then I'll talk about what it meant to American Jews, right, the Shoah. And I want to share with you, the last thing I want to share is an important piece by Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg. So two examples from Germany. One is I was a group with rabbis, actually, and we were visiting the Sachsenhausen concentration camp in Berlin, and we had a docent, a young guy in his 20s, I think, and he was giving us the upper 20s, giving us the tour. And then one of my colleagues asked them, and he's studying for a master's in history, ever. So they said, and he was a nice guy, though he had the tall, long blonde hair look about him, not just of a 20-something-year-old. So we asked him, what is it, can we ask you, that why you chose to give tours of a concentration camp? To which he answered, because my grandfather was in the SS. So we said, okay. And understanding, right, it's not like my grandfather's in the SS, so I think concentration camps are cool. No, that's not the point. The point was that he was doing tshuva. He was doing tshuva. He was living up to the fact and needed to correct the evil that his grandfather had committed. His grandfather was an SS officer, so I'm going to learn everything that I can and commit my life to teaching people about the evil that he committed, so people learn from that, and so that he can move from that. One example. My second example of two, also from Germany, also leading a group, and it was one of our, also a basically graduate age. She was a young teacher in Germany and was studying for her teacher's master's in education, and was working with our group, and this wasn't rabbinic, it was that group also, but it was another group actually. It was the group that Rabbi Marin's led that I was on, when I first got involved with the Passion Play at Ober Ammergau. So this is going back 13 years now. And we asked her why it's important for her. No, we asked her why. She was talking about how Holocaust education is done in German schools. And because she was our leader for that group, and then I was leading the group with rabbis, and I brought her back and asked her to lead a session of how she teaches Holocaust education. And then, so one of the rabbis from the group asked her, explain why is this so important to you? Because she's non-Jewish German, she's probably born in the 1980s or later. And I said, why is this so important? And she said, well, because it's a part of our history. And for me, that was so moving. It's not that it's a part of your history. It's not that there's victims that I care. It's just a part of our history as Germany. Just learning about our history. Like you read so let's universalize it in a sense. Think about America, right? It was in the news this week about the College Board stepping back on how it was structuring the AP course on African American history, right? Now, when we were in high school, there was no AP course in African American history. It wasn't even an option. Okay, so enough said about Floridian politics, but that aside, right? This is part of the understanding. It's not history that African Americans are interested in studying. It's history that Americans should understand because it is a part of our history. And that's the whole New York Times project with the 1619 project and all. This is not black history. It's American history. And how do we learn about that and understand it and take ownership collectively, right, of the history? And that's a positive development. And you see those developments, so it's my job to be optimistic as a rabbi, to see where educational development's taking to get a sense of responsibility. So let's now let me bring this to a summary here on how we memorialize the Holocaust. Holocaust memorial services. Synagogues do. We have it as a federation. We're unique, Temple Israel, because we have our thing with Westside Presbyterian. Most of the other synagogues in Bergen County, they do the Federation Yom HaShoah service that kind of floats to a different shul every year. often in Fair Lawn, because the organizers are part of the community there. It's a community because it'd be difficult for every synagogue. They wouldn't even have a critical mass to have their own Yom HaShoah service. So they combine forces. We haven't participated in that because we're invested in our interfaith service that goes back here in Ridgewood. It goes back many years. And we also have that special connection with Westside Presbyterian Church because it's Varian Fry's church. They also had a member who was a non-Jewish refugee from Germany, right, who had died a couple of years ago. That's also was the connection they had, also Westside Presbyterian. And then, and I've talked about this before, but let's talk about what we do at a Holocaust memorial service. There are two very different types of services. When you have an internal service among Jews, it's a memorial service. And it's a sense of part of the American Jewish religion, right? That's how we memorialize and go through, and saying Kaddish and memorializing the Shoah, right? It's the Federation of Jewish Men's Club project, which we do here, right? We give out the yellow candles for everyone to light the yellow candles, and how, and that too, but to make it a part of our ritual. When we do it, the interfaith thing, that's a part of what we do in the interfaith service. We light the candles, we memorialize, our own connections, our families have connections with people who came out of the Holocaust, got out of Germany just before, around that time. We have that element of it. We sing the El Male. But there's also a different thing going on, which I think is very valuable, which is that other level of working with our non-Jewish friends. And the most interesting discussion that I've had with my non-Jewish clergy colleagues is saying it should be in the temple every year. We should come to the synagogue to show what? That we're sorry that other people killed other Jews, right? And my attitude is, no, you need to remember the Holocaust in a church, because this is something that, I don't have to spell it out. It was basically Christians who committed it. But, committed by modern Western countries, and it was allowed to happen. And how does a humanity, right, allow such a thing to occur? And this is something that overall, it's more, for me, it's like more, I want to see more churches commemorate the Holocaust, right? Because then we're getting something across, right? And not just we're doing it because we feel sympathetic for the Jews. I don't need you to feel sympathetic for the Jews. I need you to feel like, where did we as a human race, right, went wrong 70 plus years ago? And that's because that's an education system, right? That's where do we learn if we're in a situation, and that's the point that Dara Horn's talking about, right? That anti-Semitism is not a thing of the past, right? So it's not a thing of the past, and if it's not something that's unique to just then, right? Then when we see things happening, when we see swastikas pop up, when we see terrible anti-Semitic statements, now part of the sense. And Peter Novick takes this to the extreme in criticizing where the sort of Jewish reaction to somebody makes an anti-Semitic remark and it's like, the next thing, gas chambers. It's like a clear line. And we sometimes will overreact. Okay, so we're allowed to be sensitive when we hear remarks that are prejudicial and hateful. But overall in a society, how do we bring the society towards what are the lessons if we can't do that collectively as a society? And I'll tell you, the yellow candles. So Marie Nasson, who works, as our office manager in the office, she doesn't like the yellow candles. Why does she like the yellow candles? Because it says in memory of the 6 million. She says, well, there were 6 million Jews, but there were also other people that were, and she is a non-Jew. She wants to memorialize all the victims of the Holocaust, which if she lights our yellow candle that says in memory of the 6 million, then that's devaluing the other losses that she would associate with. Now, I'm not saying she's right. When we say the 6 million, it's not an actual number anyway, it's a symbolic number. And it's something that as Jews internally, it's important for us to memorialize that. But it also raises the question, right, when we make the Holocaust too specific, too Jewish specific, then what lesson is it that we want to get across? So now let me go to how Arthur Hertzberg reads this. And this is an essay that he wrote for a book that was a series of essays that was published in 1995 called Anti-Semitism in America Today. And let me find it's called How Jews Use Anti-Semitism. Okay, 337, here we go. I mean, we could spend an hour just going through the points that he makes. Arthur Hertzberg was the original rabbi of Emmanuel that's now in Closter when it was in Englewood, but he was also a professor at Dartmouth and one of the leaders of the American Jewish Congress and very involved with Jewish politics. And I was his assistant rabbi for 3 years on the High Holidays for a service that we did. So he's one of the signatories on my ketubah, actually. So we were somewhat close in his later years. Okay, so he writes, historians of religions will no doubt see the unparalleled effort and passion which created the greatest of the Holocaust memorials in the United States on the Mall in Washington as the contemporary version of the building of a national Jewish cathedral. It was new, right? This is published in 1995. It was President Carter that established the United States Holocaust Commission to charge them with building a memorial, and then it was established then during the Reagan administration years. So it's relatively new here. It enshrines the Holocaust as the Via Dolorosa and crucifixion of the Jewish people. Those who come to remember are transformed in this shrine into participants in the great sacrifice. They are confirmed in their Jewishness, leaving with never again on their lips. It is their prayer, even as they remember that Hear, O Israel, the Lord, thy God, the Lord is one, was the holiest of all verses for their ancestors. All right, so he's saying, in a sense, it's because it is in the past. Because the 70s and 80s, when remembering the Holocaust was, Peter Novick writes about this also, how did, during that period, happen to have been the golden years of American Jewry, right? It was a sense that we moved past anti-Semitism, that were, Peter Novick mentions this in his book, that you had Jews elected to the United States Senate, which is the most restrictive, elite country club in the world, elected from states where there were hardly any Jews. So you had Jews in the upper reaches of politics. You had, all of the professions were open to us. We weren't facing the type of anti-Semitism that now has come back, right? That sense of physical danger. And the latent anti-Semitism, it was very easy to look the other way. We didn't need to join JCCs in the 1980s in order to go swimming. You did in the 1950s. So that's a difference. So this was the high point of American Jewry. And the argument, the analysis, is that most American Jews, their two biggest points of connection to Jewish identity in this period became the Holocaust and Israel. But Israel is more complicated because Israel also requires a certain amount of defensiveness, right? But the Holocaust was much more kosher, right? There's no politics involved. No one can be sympathetic to the Nazis the way you could be sympathetic to the Palestinians, right? It was an easier approach and a way to identify what Judaism meant. And because it was in the past and because we were so good in America that we're able to then make our Holocaust memorials, because this is the suffering that we went through, and Hertzberg is being using those Christological terms, because in a sense, because most, we're basically living in a Christian country. And how do we become comfortable Americans? Well, we need our sacrifice, we need our suffering story, And that's the Holocaust, and that legitimates us then as full Americans. And it's a very shallow Jewish identity, and that's the point he's trying to make. And he concludes the essay, and I'll just read you now the last paragraph. He says, okay, so I'll just read from the middle. The state of organized American Jewish community today requires, the question, how can we base the Jewish community not on mostly imagined fear, but on affirmation? I'm not very hopeful that a leadership which has been nurtured on fighting our enemies will make this turn, but perhaps it will. Whatever the existing leaders and organizations may think, palliatives in the name of continuity will not do, because that's the term some use. There's been a shift towards of the main American Jewish organizations focusing on Jewish integration. There's been a shift since the 90s of focusing more on Jewish continuity, right? We were integrated. We succeeded in that. Now let's focus on how to survive. Otherwise, there'll be no American Jews in another generation or two. So Hertzberg's saying it has to be more substantive. There must be a radical new beginning to make imparting Jewish learning into the dominant communal purpose of American Jewry, that we have to think about what's positive about being Jewish and not have Jewish identity rooted in the negativity of just remembering the suffering that other generations of other Jews lived through or died through in the Shoah. Dara Horn has the same conclusion. The conclusion of her book is that, well, at the beginning, she opens up by saying she'll give a talk about Jewish culture in Eastern Europe. Everyone can name 3 concentration camps, but no one can name 3 Yiddish writers. She opens the book that way. And the way she concludes it is talking about Jewish learning. When Jews have to do Jewish learning and celebrate the positive things about being Jewish. And that's what Arthur Hertzberg's crying about too. So he's saying that every Holocaust memorial and every, and is it, yes, obviously we have to remember the Holocaust. But that was it was a feel-good approach. It was a very easy way to identify as Jewish. And if we're talking about what the real lessons are, the real lessons can't be unique, because then they're just historical, right? The real lessons, there's the broader lessons, how we move as a people from it, what it means for, America. And then there's the lessons from a Jewish perspective, how I live as a Jew. There's an important Jewish theologian, Emil Fackenheim, who wrote a book, I don't know when it was probably published in the 1950s, called The Jewish Approach to History. And the thing he says in the book is, how does everything change after Auschwitz? And he makes, after Auschwitz, there's an 11th commandment. And the 11th commandment is, thou shalt not forget Auschwitz. Okay, but that's, we defining our religion about Holocaust. We don't want to be a Holocaust religion. We want to be a religion of teaching Jewish children and ourselves how to take joy in Jewish living, right? So that's, for me, it's why I resisted, studying about my interest in Germany was in the period before the Holocaust, and rather than the period of suffering. But there was, since why would you, if you're interested in Germany, of course you're studying the Nazis. Of course you're reading about the Nazis, right? And we have to find a way to incorporate that we're not pushing it aside. The first bestseller on Nazi Germany in Americas was William Shearer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. It's still in print. He was a journalist, so he was good, it's a page turner, even though it's thick. And there's not more than 3% of the book at most deals with anything about the Holocaust and persecution of Jews. It's just like a side note. So there was World War II, the Nazis, Holocaust is a different topic. So that was where there was an incredible amount of work. And I think that we're at a point now where the experience of the Jews in the Holocaust has been integrated, and this is the educational program for schools also, right? And how you teach that period. I felt really good last week because it was a final Jeopardy question answer. If you remember, the topic was World War II. I think this was Friday's Jeopardy. I watched it on DVR, don't worry, okay? I watched it on DVR. So you missed, okay. So the topic was World War II. So I was watching it then later, and then my sister-in-law was over. Somebody says, well, I have a PhD in European history, so you better know the answer. So then I put the pressure on, okay. And then the answer was, the question, the clue was this person who couldn't, could only only knew how to type two keys at a time, wrote this 20, this was by this type, I how it's phrased as saved 2,700 people. So, and the answer was what is Schindler's List, right? Because the typist he hired a typist who didn't know how to type, because he hired armaments specialists who didn't know anything, the first thing about how you build a gun. So the typist he hired didn't know how to type, but she's the one who actually, it was with one finger, with finger here, was how she actually typed the actual list of Schindler's List. So the answer was, what is Schindler's List? It made me feel so good, right? Because here, it's common knowledge, number one. But number two, it falls under the World War II category. It's not Holocaust. It's not Jewish history, right? That's a part of World War II. That part of World War II is what the Nazis did to the Jews, right? And that's, so it's the fact that it's being integrated, that's the right direction, right? That's the right direction, that we can make the history whole in a sense and think about what happened and where to go. So that's where Holocaust memorialization is so complicated, right? That there's museums, pro-services, talks, programs. It's the most funded thing in the American Jewish world, but what is it that we're trying to accomplish? It's critical to do that if the focus has to be on how it changes people, what people learn from the memory. If it's just going through a memorialization to check off a thing that this town has its Holocaust memorial, and the Holocaust memorial service was done and it was attended by 100 people, like how many people went to synagogue on Yom Kippur, and how long did you fast, and how long was your Seder, that we're not accomplishing anything. Then that's what Rabbi Hertzberg is warning, that it's just a pro forma ritual, and that's not what Jewish continuity can be based on, but it's also the society is not going to learn and grow from that. So this is the story that Peter Novick and Arthur Hertzberg, that they don't know about, because I was reading to you things that they wrote in the 1990s that they didn't know what Dara Horn we know today, right? That you can have all of the Holocaust memorialization in the world, but it doesn't stop people from walking to a synagogue and shooting people. And it doesn't stop the terrible hatred that we experience. That requires a deeper type of education, but I think we are moving that direction. Any questions? Okay, Manny and then Jackie. Go ahead.
Not a question, two quick comments. Sometimes we live within our own microcosm. I had a very scary experience recently when I was talking to my hairstylist, a relatively young, educated person living here in the Northeast, and somehow the word Auschwitz came up. I brought up something about the concentration camp Auschwitz. Never heard of it. Never. There's a person living in the New York metropolitan area who never heard of Auschwitz.
Right, Manny was saying, was talking with his hairstylist, and then came Auschwitz, and the individual had never heard the word Auschwitz. Yeah, that is scary. That is scary.
She was probably in her late 40s.
Late 40s. Yeah, that's disturbing.
The second thing I wanted to mention real quickly is there's a difference between memorializing something, learning about something, and living something. You mentioned earlier that in Israel, they memorialize the Holocaust very differently. They also live it, okay? We all probably remember back in the 1970s, a television show called The $6 Million Man. They showed it in Israel, but they would not allow the title to be promoted. They called it the $1 million Man. They called it something else, but the number 6 million has such an impact on the people living in Israel that they had to change the name. And that's the difference between memorializing something, learning about something, and living about something.
The difference between memorializing, learning, and living something. So Manny gave the example in Israel when they wanted to show the $6 million man on TV, they had to change the title because 6 million means something. And that was what I was saying with, I appreciate Maureen's point. She makes a very, very good corrective point. But of course, there's symbolism for us in the number 6 million. When I was, and it's just those where Holocaust memory is strong. Some years ago, I was teaching my course for rabbinical students in Germany, and we were looking at the rituals for beginning of birth for girl. We're always looking at what to do when a girl's born, and because you don't have a bris, obviously. And then one of the rituals, and this was in the new Reform Rabbi's manual, it had you light, it was like 6 candles, and it had a phrase for each of the 6 candles. And it says, 6? Light 6 candles? Are you crazy? For a baby? Don't you know what that means? And well, you think the Holocaust, right? You're lighting the 6 candles. And the rabbis, the American rabbis that wrote the ritual, they didn't even think about it. As soon as I pointed out to them, I said, oh my God, you're right. We can't have that there. But it didn't occur to them, whereas in Germany, again, like in Israel, for German Jews in Israel, if you see 6 candles lined up, that's like when we have our Yom HaShoah service there in the 6th, although we put a 7th. We put a 7th because of, I mentioned Dr. Schott, who's now died from Westside Presbyterian. He represented the non-Jewish victims, and his descendants will hopefully be, and they'll still light that candle in his memory. But we're very unique in having 7 candles. I don't think the Federation service, I would be surprised if it's not 6 there. Jackie. Right.
That it should be recognized that 5 million others were killed. Maybe the churches in Ridgewood should put out a blue candle or a white candle when we're putting out our yellow candles so that everyone who passed is remembered, Jewish or non-Jewish. And because that would actually bring it home for Christians maybe, make it a little more part of it's not just a Jewish problem.
Yeah, and that's interesting, right? So what Jackie's saying is that just as we, in Ridgewood, in our interfaith Holocaust service, we have the 7th candle, that the church is important just as we have a yellow candle or the 6th, that they should be a way for the non-Jews to have maybe a different color or the different candle to remember that it wasn't just Jews who were killed, right? But also, right, on the flip side, there shouldn't have to have been non-Jewish victims in order for non-Jews to have to memorialize the Holocaust, right? Right. Right, so the question, I'm just summarizing because of people watching. So the question is, what are we trying to accomplish, right? What's the goal? And that's ultimately the pedagogic goal of all of these things. Yeah. Right. Francis would have gone whenever it was. Right. Right. Right.
St. Catherine's and whatever,
right.
And the Methodist Church,
Right.
And now Carmel.
Right.
And I almost think that was nicer because we have so many churches in
Yeah.
Ridgewood, or houses of worship. We could even go to, a mosque at this point.
Right.
It doesn't, but it is now.
So the first thing Jackie said was that the evolution of Holocaust museums, that the focus is on tolerance and teaching tolerance, and that's important in the Washington Institute. What's interesting was how the New York City's Holocaust Museum got developed, that it was reconfigured. It's called the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And that's because of the criticisms that people like Rabbi Hertzberg had made, right? That it shouldn't, it shouldn't just be about memorializing the Holocaust. There should be a sense. So there's the way that museum is structured is the first floor is Jewish life before the Holocaust. Then there's a whole section, which is the Holocaust Museum, history teaching part, and then Jewish life in America after the Holocaust. You know, and then you finish up and you get this beautiful view of the Statue of Liberty. So there is, it goes back to heritage and which is internally that the New York Jewish community needed to focus on have those positive elements and not just the memorialization element. Tolerance is so critical. Jackie mentioned we're talking about our Ridgewood Holocaust service that we originally it visited various different churches and she said why. It was because of the connection with Varian Fry and also Francis Schott, who was a Kristallnacht, non-Jewish Kristallnacht survivor who passed away a couple of years ago. That's his church at Westside Presbyterian. Yes, there is a value in other churches. So that's a pragmatic thing. Because Francis Schott is not with us anymore. Right, I thought it was important for us to get a commitment from Westside Presbyterian Church that they had a special connection, and for them to take ownership there. I mean, they do. Varian Fry is the only portrait that hangs in their lobby. It's extraordinary, and it mentions right who rescued Jews from the Holocaust. Is when you walk into Westside Presbyterian Church, that's there. Right now, when we do the service, it's on the wall, sort of on the back. So we're gonna put it like in a central. Right as you enter, so everyone will see it as I walk in. It's not something they have to look for, but it is there. There is that connection, and I want it. And they've had change of clergy leadership, and Frank has died now, so I thought it was important to get their commitment from their side, and they are paying for. They're joining us and really paying for Dara Horn. So it's literally paid off. Also, in a sense. Any last comments or questions for today, Linda? This one. Right. How do I summarize what you said for the people watching? Right, but how do we bring about accountability? Because it's easier when Americans remember history, slavery. We know Americans are not very good at taking accountability or taking responsibility. So I talk about slavery. It's like, those racist Southerners, as if there's no racial prejudice in the North, right? I mean, it's an easy thing, and it's the same thing we say, those Germans. It's the same idea, right? And that's why there's sort of that universal sense, and that's what Hannah Arendt's point is, that but the Germans did take accountability, but it's also because it's one country, right? For us, because of the divisions, because the U.S. is, there are reasons why Germany had to, in a sense, and because they lost, and it's obviously there's difference, but that sense of how do we come to that point of accountability, and that's why, in a sense, the argument is why Holocaust memorialization it was easy to get Congress and the President to approve, because it's something that other people did on the other side of the world, and so I'm memorializing what other people should be accountable for. Whereas what about memorializing what we need to be accountable for, and owning up also to what America could have done? I mean, we were learning, go back to our class this morning, right? What was the conference called? What was it called? The Evian Conference. Good boys there in the back. Let's pretend they knew the answer. Okay. The Evian Conference in July of 1938. It's basically organized at the instigation of President Roosevelt for every country in the world to how are we going to help the Jews who are suffering in Nazi Germany. And basically, U.S. said, well, we're accepting 27,000 Jews, refugees a year. We can't, they wouldn't even say the word Jews. We can't increase that number, but other countries should. And every country just said the same thing. And then the conference ends with Roosevelt's delegates saying, he actually said, after 4 or 5 days of meeting, he said, we have a very substantive, concrete success of this conference is the setting up of the Intergovernmental Commission on Refugees. So they set up a committee. That's what they accomplished, so. James.
The author's
Clint Smith, yes, thank you. I know I got Chris from.
And in a recent article in The Atlantic that he published, one of the points made by one of the persons he interviewed, to Linda's point, was that it's easier in Germany. There are no Jews of the population. It's 0.03% of the population. Whereas African Americans are 12.5%.
Right.
He's not using just when he's reporting it. Some folks feel like it would be a lightning rod to do it. It's just too politically sensitive. Whereas in Israel, in Germany, they're no Jews.
Right, what the argument that Clint Smith, who wrote the book, The Words Pass, How the Word is Passed, is the best-selling book that he wrote about how the U.S. deals with its legacy of the slavery past. Right, so it was an article that he wrote in The Atlantic where he talked about the comparisons with Germany, and he's gone and visited and done some research there. The argument he made is it's easier for the Germans to do it because there are relatively no Jews in Germany today. It's a tiny, tiny proportion of the population, whereas the African American population is a significant part. It's about over 12.5%.
Article, by the way, Smith's tone is so positive. He doesn't have any agenda. He's a lovely.
Craig is recommending Smith's tone. It's a no specific agenda, and yeah. So I'm gonna have to. I haven't read his article in the Atlantic. I do have to. Susan Neiman's article, it does have a tone to it. She has a part at the end of the book where she makes a case in favor of reparations for slavery, and she lays out all the arguments against it and argues point by point, and she really made me stop and think, and was a real good thinker. But she's got an agenda that she's pushing through, and it's good to hear that he's, yeah. The Atlantic, if I read it, can I send a link? Okay, we're getting it there. Yeah, there's a lot more that I can say on how the situation in Germany is different. I don't think it's not just because Jews are a very tiny portion of the population, but they are also, they're very visible. And it was the point that he's quoting for someone in Germany who's involved with memorialization that was saying that it's easier for us because the Jews are a smaller part of the population. In Germany, it's critical because they lost the war and they have to deal with this, and it's because it's so much more recent. How do you explain the justification for being now again, the most important country in Europe, especially after Brexit, with no insults to the French. Right, and then how do you justify a state when you're building it on the ashes of what has happened, and how do you take account of that? So it's a very internal process for Germans in dealing with that, whereas the U.S. legacy of slavery and racial prejudice is deep. It goes back further. It's in a sense more complicated, which is why it's harder to take grips. And it's also because we're divided into 50 different little countries also, But okay, anyway, thank you. So we're going to get a lot of time. Your homework for next time is to, if you don't want to read The Merchant of Venice, which we'll talk about, at least read Dara Horn's chapter on The Merchant of Venice, which the title of that chapter is Commuting with Shylock. It's the 11th chapter, starts in 193 in the book, so that'll be April 9th. You have plenty of time to prepare. Okay.